Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now in today's video we're going to take a look at DCC Fitting, this Thompson Class 01, which of course I recently reviewed. So going back to the review that I did on this locomotive a couple of weeks back, I received a good number of comments and favourable feedback. So thank you to all of those who submitted their feedback on that review. Now interestingly, one of the common comments was asking about DCC fitting, and that some folk would be very keen to see how the DC fitting takes place. So I definitely think it's a very valid point. And I think it's very important to include DCC fitting when I do a locomotive review. Now, I'd had some thoughts about it, and what I'm actually going to do is keep the DCC fitting as a separate video rather than actually cram it all into the review itself. I know that there are probably a large number of viewers of this channel who still operate in analog, and so going through the DCC process would be somewhat pointless. And then of course there will be folk who already have one of these locomotives and they don't really want to wade through a review of the locomotive. All they're keen to find out about is how to DCC fit the locomotive. So I think whenever I do a review on a locomotive that I've purchased, I will do two separate videos. So there'll be the video for the review and then there'll be another one that outlines the DCC fitting. So I think without further ado, let's just get into how I went about fitting this locomotive with a DCC chip. So we'll take a closer look at installing a DCC decoder in this locomotive. Now, I had previously installed a decoder. I've now taken that out, put in the blanking chip, so we can actually go through this process from start to finish. So the decoder I'm using is a DCC Concepts Zen Black decoder, and this particular one is a 21 pin decoder, but it also includes an 8-pin harness. So I actually quite like using these decoders because they're really quite versatile, particularly if you sell on a locomotive and you want to take the decoder out. The chances are you'll be able to reuse it in another locomotive because you've got both options, 21 pin or 8 pin. Now, regardless of really any locomotive that has a reasonable amount of detail, you have to be super careful working with these, and there are so many little fine pieces. Like for example, on the corner of this tender there is a little hook of some sort, and that is so fine and detailed that anything like that could easily break off. So the benefit with this locomotive in some respects in terms of its DCC fitting is that the decoder is in the tender. So that is a huge advantage over a decoder that might be in the locomotive itself. So the first thing we need is a flathead screwdriver to undo the coupling screw, and it's just simply a case of unscrewing the tender end and removing that screw and sliding the coupling rod out of the way. Now the next step here is getting to the wee plug that's inserted in here. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, this can actually be really tricky in some respects. I had a Q1 class Hornby locomotive where the plug was particularly stiff in trying to get it out, and unfortunately I'd actually pulled some of the wires actually out of the end of the plug. So just using a very small flathead screwdriver, what I tend to do is just very carefully work out the plug from each end, and that gives you enough to sort of grip on and pull the rest of it out. Definitely, whatever you do, don't grab the wires and try to pull on those, because the chances are you actually pull the wires out of the plug itself. So it's just a case of working each end and alternating sides because you don't want to just sort of work it out from one side only, because you don't want to bend the pins either. So once you've got the majority of it out, it should just slide out, and out it comes. So we can now move the locomotive aside, as nothing needs to be done with that, and we can now look at the tender itself. Now once again, there is lots and lots of little wee details all around this tender. There's wee handles here, there's brackets, there's all sorts of very fine plastic details, so you have to be very careful at handling this. Now on the bottom you can see 3 screws here, and initially you might think, well, okay, you undo these screws and that opens the tender up, and you couldn't be more wrong. So referring to the instructions that come with this locomotive, there is 2 small Phillips head screws, and if you can make them out, there's one here and the other one is tucked in there. So they're the only screws that need to be undone. You don't need to undo these screws here. So with the Phillips head screwdriver, it's just a case of getting down in here. Now I'm actually using a jeweler's screwdrivers which are magnetized, and it's quite handy if your screwdriver is magnetized, because the screw is actually down quite deep in the recess of this underframe. So if you didn't have a magnetized screwdriver, of course you'd have to turn it up the right way and tap the screws out. So now that the screw's out, you're thinking, right, okay, this just pops off. Well, it doesn't. It's mystery number 2. Now, referring back to the manual again, there is this set of arrows, and one is to push the underframe forward while levering out the front. Now, that seems like a relatively simple process, but whether it's my particular model or whether it's part of the moulding of this tender, it is actually quite tricky to get this out. So with the tender body, holding the tender body and a reasonably good grip here, making sure that you're not touching any of these small fine bits, you pull the tender body backwards while holding the chassis. So there is a little clip that's down tucked in underneath here, and by pulling this back you're sort of releasing it at this end somewhere where it seems to be clipped in a way, but I can't find where that clip is. And then you do have to use quite a bit of force to while pulling it back and pushing this chassis forward and then pulling it out. Now you can see here that that lever is actually permanently fixed to the actual chassis part, so you have to be very careful not to break that. So that's the body that's come off. Now you can see here, just at the end of that body, there is a little clip, and that slots into just the end here by the decoder socket. So when installing this back, and we'll go through that process shortly, there's a certain way of putting this back on again as well. So this is our tender now, and as we can see, we've got a little spot here for a speaker. Not a lot of room in there by the looks of it. And then of course we've got our 8-pin socket, which has currently got the blanking plate in it. So with the blanking plate, usually what I sort of do, I mean, these usually sort of come out if you get a good grip on either side and pull it up. But what I tend to do, because some can be really quite tight, is just getting a flathead screwdriver and just easing it up, a little bit like how I did for the tender socket, and just easing it up each side until it's mostly out. And then once it's mostly out, then you can pull the blanking socket out, and that's our socket there. Now this particular DC socket is very good, and that it clearly indicates pin 1, which is a little bit hidden by that red wire, but it's right in there. So sometimes I often find that some manufacturers don't bother to indicate which is pin 1, which can be annoying, but it's clearly shown here. Now pin 1 of course on a decoder is the orange wire, so on the decoder itself you can see the orange wire in the top corner, and that is pin 1. So it's just simply a case of lining up the pins with the socket holes. And I guess the other thing really that you really should check, at least before you install the decoder, is just to make sure that all the pins on here are nice and straight and evenly spaced apart, that none of them look like they're sort of off skew or bent in any way. And if they are, then it might be a case of carefully straightening them a bit, maybe with a pair of tweezers. So it's then just a case of lining up the pins with the holes like so, and then just carefully pushing it in, and it just slides into place. Now that fitted in very nicely, and it was very smooth in installing that. Sometimes you'll actually find they can be a little bit stiff or a little bit tight when pushing these in. So now we've got our decoder in place, and of course we've got the decoder and it's sort of loosely jumbled together with its wires. Now I'm actually just going to leave this like this because it's not going to be actually interfering with anything else, and there is actually a reasonable amount of space inside this tender. So we'll now put the body back on the chassis. The main thing to consider, of course, when attaching the body back onto the chassis is that the wires aren't interfering with where screws might be coming through. So as you can see here, there's the 2 screw holes that secure the body to the chassis, and there's no wires in the way at all in this particular situation. So the clip on the end of this body just slots into that space at the back there, and it almost sort of acts like a hinge. So once it's in place, then it's a case of hinging it down, being careful of course not to knock or bend or break this lever at this end, and sliding it down, and you hear just a slight click, and that's it, secured in place. Now we'll reinsert the screws in here, and then of course, as I mentioned, this is where the magnetized screwdriver comes in handy, and then slowly drop it into place. Now what I actually do when it comes to these, because I think these are self-threading screws, is I'll actually do a couple of turns anti-clockwise, and you can actually hear it clonking with the thread, and that's just lightly, and then once you've gone past that, then you can tighten it in place. It just means that you're less likely to create a new thread on the plastic grommet inside the chassis. So once again, in a couple of anti-clockwise, and you can sort of hear it clonk, and then turn it clockwise and you can feel it sliding into the thread that was already created from the factory. So we now have that all closed up and secure, and it's now a case of reattaching the tender to the locomotive. Now you notice on the end of the locomotive the coupling bar has 2 holes here. Now the inner hole is actually if you wanted to close couple the tender to the locomotive, but interestingly when I looked at that, there's absolutely no way that that second hole would be of any use whatsoever, because when you actually put a screw in that second hole, the tender actually goes hard up against the cab doors and hard up against the foot plate, and there's just simply no way that it would actually be able to operate around any corners. So the second hole here, I reckon, is more if it was going to be a static display and never get used. So it's a bit pointless to me, that second hole. So we'll just line these up roughly in the cradle, and the first thing of course we've got to do is reattach the plug into the socket, and a little bit easier than taking the socket out, I'm actually just using a pair of tweezers to get in here, because it's just going to be easier to get in here rather than using my fingers. And then it's just a case of pushing that in, and once again just use a flathead screwdriver just to push it in, but be just careful not to pinch the wires. I've learnt the hard way, of course, as I mentioned with my Q1, because the cables actually tore out of the back of the plug, and it was quite a mission having to repair that. So that's now secured into place, and we can now reattach the coupling rod. And I wouldn't say that this design is the best, unfortunately. There could be better ways of doing this, and the choice of screw is a bit weird as well. I don't know why they decided to use flathead screws on this particular setup here. A Phillips head screw would have been so much better, because then I could actually set it up magnetized in the screwdriver to actually get it in here. But unfortunately the flathead doesn't really work with a magnetized screwdriver without going all wobbly and wonky. So it's a case of having to put the screw in by hand initially, and it's really fiddly because it's right next to those wheels. And then once you've got that in there, more or less, then we can get the flathead screwdriver and tighten the screw up. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird setup. And the other thing too is that the screw is smaller than the actual hole in the drawbar, so it has some movement in it, and you can actually tighten the screw up completely. It doesn't clamp the drawbar down to the underbase of the tender. So that is it. That is a DCC fitting for the Hornby Thompson Class 01, and it's relatively easy. It's certainly a lot easier than other DCC fittings that I've done, and I'm sure that some other reviews are going to come up where DCC fitting is the equivalent to jumping through hoops of burning fire. So there we have it. That is the locomotive now DCC fitted, and I certainly hope that this was helpful to those who wanted to know about DCC fitting for this particular locomotive. And I guess it would be similar to a lot of other Hornby locomotives too, that have a socket in the tender and cables connected between the tender and the locomotive. So before I sign off, I thought I'd just like to mention a few newsworthy updates to Station Road channel. Now, one of them is I have actually monetized the Station Road channel now. So late last year, YouTube decided to change the rules and put adverts into non-monetized channels regardless. So I thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. That's all I can say. So if I'm going to have ads in my videos, then I might as well actually seek a little bit of revenue from those ads. So I thought, in monetizing the channel, I better actually do something about the backdrop that often sits behind me during my videos. So you may have noticed I have now added a few interesting little bits and pieces, and this is purely for you guys to look at in case you're really not interested in looking at me. Now, I've changed the sign up the back there, and there's also a bunch of other model railway related material. So I'll sign off for now. I certainly hope today's video was helpful for any of you who are planning on installing DCC into your Hornby Thompson Class 01. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also leave your comments and feedback, which I will endeavour to respond to. Take care, look after yourselves, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.